Congresswoman Crockett, Judge Edith Jones said, her voice slicing through the heavy courtroom silence. Every head turned as the veteran judge leaned forward, eyes unwavering. Your recent remarks about the judiciary, do you truly stand by them? The air felt electric. Reporters stopped typing. Lawyers shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't every day that a sitting member of Congress was called out by one of the most respected judges in America, especially not inside a federal courtroom. Representative Jasmine Crockett, calm but visibly tense, rose from her seat. For a fleeting moment, the two women, separated by generation, ideology, and philosophy, stood locked in a silent duel of conviction. I stand, Crockett said finally, her tone measured, for a justice system that lives up to the promise written above every courtroom door, equal justice under law. A ripple ran through the gallery. Judge Jones studied her carefully, her lined face giving away nothing. Equal justice, she repeated slowly, is not achieved by undermining those who interpret the law. You, of all people, should understand that. I do, Your Honor, Crockett replied, her voice growing stronger. But I also understand that justice loses its power when people no longer trust those who deliver it. My criticism isn't of judges, it's of complacency. When fairness feels optional, democracy begins to fracture. The judge's gavel rested untouched. Her expression softened, just barely. For decades, she had fought to keep politics out of the courts, to protect the sacred independence of the bench. Yet the Congresswoman's words struck something deeper, an echo of truth that was hard to dismiss. You speak boldly, Jones said at last. Perhaps too boldly for a system that values restraint. Respectfully, Judge, Crockett answered. This country was built by people who refused to stay silent when restraint became complicity. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. No one moved, no one whispered. Even the bailiff's hand froze mid-motion. Then, as the tension broke, quiet applause began, hesitant at first, then louder, until it filled the chamber with something rare, hope. Judge Jones didn't silence the room. Instead, she nodded once, a gesture small but monumental. Congresswoman, she said, her tone shifting from reprimand to recognition. Perhaps you understand the Constitution better than I thought. Crockett smiled, humbled yet resolute. And perhaps, Your Honor, she replied softly. We both just want the same thing, a justice system worthy of the people it serves. When the session ended, those present knew they had witnessed more than a clash of power. They had seen two women, one seasoned by decades, one rising with fire, find common ground in the shared duty of truth. Outside the courthouse, as cameras flashed and headlines took shape, the story wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about courage meeting wisdom, conviction meeting grace, and the quiet reminder that America's strength lies not in its divisions, but in its ability to listen, learn, and rise above them. Congresswoman Crockett, Judge Edith Jones said, rising from the front row as the room fell into an almost sacred silence. The steady rhythm of the conference had broken the moment she stood. Every conversation, every quiet note-taking, stopped cold. Her presence carried the gravity of decades on the federal bench, and her voice, calm, deliberate, unmistakably authoritative, cut through the tension like a bell. I respect your dedication to reform, she began, walking toward the podium. But your words raise serious questions about how we preserve the integrity of justice in this country. Representative Jasmine Crockett froze for only a moment before meeting the judge's gaze. The two women faced each other, one seasoned by nearly 40 years of legal service, the other powered by the restless conviction of change. Behind them, hundreds watched, unsure whether they were witnessing a confrontation or the start of something historic. Moments earlier, Crockett had delivered a fiery address on the failures of the criminal justice system, racial disparities in sentencing, over-incarceration, prisons filled with the forgotten. Her voice had carried hope, frustration, and defiance in equal measure. But then she had crossed a quiet line. When judges cling to outdated interpretations, she had declared, they don't preserve justice, they delay it. Progress demands courage, even from those in robes. The words had rippled through the audience like a fault line. Some nodded in agreement. Others stiffened in disbelief. And in the front row, Judge Jones, who had spent a lifetime defending judicial independence, had watched with deepening concern. Now, standing before the podium, she spoke with calm precision. Reform is not rebellion, Congresswoman, she said. And criticism must never come at the expense of public trust in the courts. The moment our citizens believe judges serve politics instead of law, we lose the very foundation that protects your right to speak freely today. Crockett took a slow breath. With respect, Your Honor, trust isn't blind loyalty. People lose faith when justice feels unreachable. I'm not attacking the courts. I'm asking them to evolve with the nation they serve. A quiet murmur spread across the room again. Jones studied her, saw the resolve, the sincerity, the idealism of someone who had spent her career fighting for those unseen by the system. She could not dismiss that fire. I once stood where you are, the judge replied, her tone softening. Young, certain that change required shaking the walls. But the rule of law, our Constitution, it's what holds this nation steady when everything else feels uncertain. Be careful not to weaken what protects us all. And yet, Crockett countered gently, what protects us must also reflect us. The law should not only restrain power, it should redeem it. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was charged, not hostile, but heavy with mutual understanding. Two women, generations apart, each defending an institution she loved, each refusing to let it lose its soul. Then, slowly, Judge Jones nodded. Perhaps, she said, progress and preservation don't have to be enemies. The Congresswoman's expression softened. Only if we listen to each other, she replied. Applause began, tentative, then building into something sustained, unplanned, and deeply human. It wasn't about victory. It was about recognition, the kind that bridges differences rather than deepens them. As the two women shook hands, the cameras caught a rare moment of grace in American public life. Disagreement without disdain, challenge without contempt, strength without arrogance. Later, many would say that the exchange changed the tone of the entire conference. Some called it a lesson in civility. Others, a turning point for a generation that had forgotten how to debate with respect. But for those in that room, it was simpler than that. They had just witnessed what democracy looks like when courage meets conscience, and when two powerful voices, instead of trying to silence each other, choose to listen. Congresswoman Crockett, Judge Edith H. Jones began, her tone calm, but carrying the unmistakable authority of decades on the federal bench. Your recent remarks, today included, reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of the judiciary's purpose in our constitutional system. The room went utterly still. Every sound, papers rustling, pens tapping, vanished. Only her voice filled the air. When you imply that judges should rule based on social desires rather than legal principles, she continued, you're not just challenging opinions. You're undermining the very independence that keeps justice free from political influence. Judge Jones's words landed with precision, not anger. And when you suggest that respect for judicial authority should depend on whether you agree with a ruling, she added, you risk tearing at the separation of powers that safeguards every liberty we enjoy as Americans. Crockett stood motionless behind the podium, her earlier fire replaced by quiet reflection. The silence felt heavy, charged not with hostility, but with the weight of consequence. Reporters exchanged glances. Even veteran judges looked uneasy. This was no ordinary exchange. It was a reckoning between two institutions bound by duty, yet divided by perspective. After several long seconds, Crockett finally spoke. Judge Jones, she said, her voice lower, steadier. I appreciate your honesty and your courage in saying this directly. Could you help me understand where I may have crossed the line? The question stunned the room. In an era of deflection and defensiveness, humility was almost revolutionary. Judge Jones blinked, momentarily taken aback. Then she nodded. Congresswoman, your passion for justice is something this country needs, she said gently. But advocacy and adjudication serve different masters. Legislators craft laws to reflect society's evolution. Judges interpret those laws to preserve the integrity of the system. When one tries to do the other's job, the balance collapses. Crockett listened intently, her expression thoughtful. I see, she murmured. I've spoken out of frustration about decisions that, to me, seem to hold people back. I never meant to erode trust in the courts. Judge Jones's tone softened further. Frustration is natural. Every generation feels the courts move too slowly. But that slowness, what some call caution, is what keeps justice from being swept away by the politics of the moment. Our founders designed it that way for a reason. The Congresswoman nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Then tell me, she said, how can someone like me, someone pushing for reform, do it without disrespecting the bench? That question seemed to shift the entire atmosphere. The tension melted into something almost tender, a shared recognition of purpose between two women who, for all their differences, wanted the same thing, a fairer nation. Speak truth, Judge Jones said, but speak it with care. Critique the system, not its servants. Argue for change, but never for chaos. The moment citizens stop believing that the courts are fair, the law itself begins to lose its soul. Crockett's eyes glistened. You're right, she said quietly. My words have weight. I forgot that. I let frustration sound like contempt, and that was wrong. A gasp rippled through the audience. In a time when apologies were rare and public figures guarded their pride like armor, what came next stunned even the most seasoned observers. Judge Jones, Crockett said clearly, I owe the judiciary an apology. I let my disappointment in outcomes blind me to the discipline and sacrifice it takes to uphold the rule of law. For that, I am truly sorry. The silence that followed was profound, almost sacred. Even the court reporters paused, hands hovering above their keys. One judge in the back bowed his head. Judge Jones studied her for a long moment. Then she spoke softly, almost as if to herself. Congresswoman, humility is the first step toward wisdom. You've taken that step today. Crockett's voice trembled, but her words were firm. And I'll do better, with the same passion, but more respect. The judge extended her hand. Crockett took it without hesitation. The applause began slowly, then grew, spreading through the hall like a wave. It wasn't applause for victory, but for something rarer, grace. Two women, standing on opposite sides of power, had met not as adversaries, but as equals in purpose. And in that quiet act of mutual respect, they reminded everyone watching that true leadership in America isn't about never being wrong. It's about being brave enough to admit when you are, and strong enough to grow from it. I see now, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett said quietly, her voice trembling with sincerity, that in my pursuit of justice, I allowed my passion to blur my understanding of constitutional balance, of how our branches of government are meant to work in harmony, not competition. Every ear in the courtroom strained to hear her words. Even the bailiffs, who were trained to remain impassive, leaned forward ever so slightly. The silence was so deep it felt sacred. Crockett clasped her hands before her, her voice steady but filled with remorse. As a former attorney, I should have known better. I should have remembered that the true strength of our legal system lies in its independence, not in its popularity, not in bending to the will of public opinion. My remarks implied otherwise, and that was wrong. For that, I offer my sincere apology. The transformation in tone was remarkable. The confrontation that had started with tension and defiance was now unfolding into something rare and profoundly human, a public act of humility. In the audience, several senior attorneys, hardened by years in courtrooms, were visibly moved. Even the journalists, usually quick to capture conflict, hesitated to type, unwilling to interrupt the gravity of the moment. Judge Edith Jones took a slow step forward. Her black robe swayed softly, the faint sound of the fabric carrying across the hushed room. Her face, once stern, softened, not with indulgence, but with a kind of measured compassion that comes only from wisdom earned over decades. Congresswoman Crockett, she began, her tone both firm and warm. Your willingness to reflect rather than react shows strength, not weakness. It takes genuine courage to acknowledge when emotion has overtaken reason, especially for someone in public life. She paused, allowing her words to settle, her gaze steady. Your passion for justice is not the problem. This country needs passion, desperately, but it must be anchored in principle. When passion outruns discipline, it endangers what it seeks to protect. And when criticism of the courts replaces engagement with the law itself, we risk eroding the very foundation that guards liberty for all. Crockett nodded, her expression open, earnest. Then help me understand, she said softly. How do I fight for reform? How do I push for change? without crossing the line into disrespecting judicial independence. The question caught many by surprise. It wasn't a performance. It was a plea to understand, to learn. You could feel the collective exhale in the room. Judges, lawyers, students, and clerks, all realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Humility in leadership. For the first time that morning, Judge Jones smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it shifted the energy of the entire space. "Congresswoman," she said, "I would be honored to help you find that balance. Because when advocacy and respect walk hand in hand, reform becomes not rebellion, but renewal." She turned slightly, now addressing not just Crockett, but the full audience. The shift in her tone was unmistakable. It was no longer a scolding, but a masterclass in civic understanding. "The brilliance of our system," she said, gesturing toward the framed Constitution hanging behind her, "is that each branch has its own sacred duty. You, in Congress, are the architects of law. You identify what no longer works and write what must be improved. We, in the judiciary, are its interpreters. Our oath is not to public sentiment, but to the Constitution itself. That is how the system endures." Her voice grew firmer. "So when you see a decision that feels unjust, your path isn't to attack the judge who made it, but to examine the law that guided it. Laws shape outcomes. Judges apply them. Real change begins where you stand, not where we sit." Crockett's eyes glistened with tears she didn't bother to hide. "Then I have work to do," she said softly. "And so do we all," Judge Jones replied, her words echoing through the chamber. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the room erupted into applause, not thunderous, but steady and heartfelt, the sound of shared respect. It wasn't for victory or defeat. It was for integrity, for accountability. For two women, one the guardian of tradition, the other the voice of renewal, who had met not in battle, but in understanding. Outside, as the doors opened and the crowd spilled into the marble hallway, the talk wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about what America too often forgets, that strength and humility are not opposites, that disagreement can coexist with respect, and that true leadership begins when listening replaces pride. That morning, in a single courtroom, the nation's ideals had not just been spoken, they had been lived. "It's not about questioning the judges," Judge Edith Jones said evenly, her voice carrying the weight of calm authority. "It's about examining whether the laws themselves need to change. That's how reform happens, without compromising the independence that keeps our system honest." Representative Jasmine Crockett nodded, deeply attentive. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather notebook, flipping it open with quiet purpose. As she began taking notes, the room collectively exhaled. This wasn't the posture of a politician defending her rhetoric. It was the posture of a student eager to understand. For a brief moment, the sight left everyone stunned. A sitting member of Congress, pen in hand, taking notes from a federal judge. It was as symbolic as it was humbling. "So," Crockett said softly, glancing up from her page, "when I see sentencing disparities that feel unjust, my responsibility is to focus on changing the sentencing laws themselves, not condemning the judges who are following them." "Precisely," Judge Jones replied, her tone warm with approval. "That's where your power lies. Judges don't write laws. We interpret them. But when lawmakers recognize where those laws fall short and work to improve them, that's when justice truly advances." Her voice grew more personal, almost reflective. "Believe me, Congresswoman, many of us on the bench see the flaws in the system every day. We recognize the inequities, the outdated statutes, the human consequences that come from rigid laws. But our oath, to apply the law as written, is sacred. We cannot fix injustice by ignoring the Constitution." The judge paused, letting her words settle like truth sinking into stone. "I've served 37 years on this court," she continued, her voice softer now. "And I've seen even well-intentioned laws yield unintended harm. Sometimes, the very reforms meant to protect people end up trapping them in different kinds of unfairness. That's why we need lawmakers like you, to reshape those laws through the right channels, not through pressure campaigns against judges simply doing their duty." Crockett's brow furrowed, her pen resting still. A look of recognition spread across her face, an understanding that felt less like surrender and more like awakening. Then what you're saying, she said slowly, is that judges and lawmakers shouldn't see each other as adversaries. We're not on opposite sides. We're partners in making justice real. Judge Jones smiled faintly, the expression rare and genuine. Exactly. When each branch honors the role of the other, reform and stability can coexist. You hold the power to create change, and we hold the duty to uphold the Constitution. Together, those forces preserve liberty. The transformation in the room was remarkable. The tension that had once filled the air with static now gave way to something electric yet peaceful: respect. People weren't just listening. They were witnessing the very principles they'd spent careers studying brought to life before them. Crockett closed her notebook slowly, her eyes meeting the judge's. "Judge Jones," she said, her voice carrying new conviction, "I want to make a public commitment. From this day forward, I'll focus my advocacy on reforming the laws themselves, not undermining the judiciary. And if I ever stray from that, I ask that you, and anyone here, hold me accountable." The words landed with force and grace. Then, turning toward the rows of judges and attorneys, Crockett continued, "To any member of the judiciary who felt disrespected by my previous remarks, I owe you an apology. You deserve not only my respect, but my partnership. We may work in different chambers, but our purpose is the same: justice that serves the people." Judge Jones's eyes softened again, the corners of her lips curving just slightly. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, her voice carrying warmth and authority in equal measure, "your words honor this courtroom. Your growth honors your office. And yes, I will hold you to that promise, not as an adversary, but as an ally in the service of our Constitution." For a heartbeat, the room remained utterly still. Then someone in the back began to clap. Once, twice, and soon the entire hall joined in. Applause rolled through the chamber, breaking through decades of formality. Judges, clerks, lawyers, even court officers rose to their feet. It wasn't just admiration, it was relief, hope, pride. A reminder that decency and accountability were still possible in public life. Judge Jones let the applause continue for a full minute before she lifted her hand, a quiet gesture that restored silence at once. Her gaze swept the room, then returned to Crockett. "This," she said softly, "is how democracy renews itself. Not through division, but through humility, dialogue, and respect." And for that one extraordinary morning, in a federal courtroom that had seen its share of arguments and verdicts, justice itself seemed to breathe, alive, dignified, and, for once, united. When the applause finally subsided and the room fell into reverent silence, Judge Jones leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the bench. What she said next would later be quoted in classrooms, editorials, and law journals across the nation. "What we've witnessed today," she began, her tone measured yet warm, "is exactly what our founders hoped for: a living example of how democracy should function. Distinct branches of government, engaging in honest, respectful dialogue about their roles, united not by partisanship, but by a shared devotion to the American people and the Constitution that binds us all." Her gaze found Congresswoman Crockett, and something almost tender flickered behind her steady eyes. "Congresswoman," she said, her voice softening, "you've shown us that leadership isn't about being flawless. It's about having the courage to admit when you've been wrong and the integrity to grow from it. That humility, that willingness to listen, is what gives strength to our democracy." The quiet that followed was heavy with emotion. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. As Judge Jones rose, signaling the close of the session, something truly remarkable happened. Several other judges, men and women who had spent decades guarding their composure behind the formality of the bench, stood and approached Congresswoman Crockett. One by one, they shook her hand, thanked her for her words, and expressed admiration for her sincerity. Observers later described the moment as one of the most powerful displays of mutual respect between the judiciary and the legislature in living memory. It was not a political gesture, but something pure, an affirmation that humility and dialogue could still bridge even the deepest divides. Within hours, the story escaped the courtroom walls. Short clips of the exchange began circulating on social media. Crockett's steady voice, Judge Jones's calm reply, the standing ovation. By nightfall, millions had watched it. Across political lines, Americans found something familiar and comforting in what they saw: decency. News outlets from coast to coast seized on the story. Headlines read, "A moment of grace in a divided time," and "Judge and Congresswoman show America how respect looks." Commentators who rarely agreed on anything seemed to share a rare consensus that this was a scene worth celebrating. Harvard constitutional scholar Lawrence Tribe told a reporter, "What we witnessed wasn't just political civility, it was moral courage on both sides." Representative Crockett demonstrated that strength and humility can coexist, and Judge Jones showed that judicial authority can lead with compassion as well as conviction. Even the American Bar Association issued a formal statement, something it rarely does for individual events. The exchange between Representative Jasmine Crockett and Judge Edith Jones, it read, exemplifies the highest ideals of American public service. Their dialogue reminds us that maintaining respect between the branches of government is not only constitutional duty, it is moral duty. In the days that followed, Crockett's schedule filled with interview requests. On national television, she spoke candidly, not as a politician managing an image, but as a public servant transformed. "Judge Jones taught me something I'll carry for the rest of my life," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "She showed me that passion for justice must never come at the expense of respect for the institutions that sustain it. My role isn't to pressure judges into outcomes I prefer. It's to help create better laws so that justice can be served more fairly." When a reporter asked her why she chose to make such a public apology, Crockett didn't hesitate. "Because accountability shouldn't scare us," she said simply. "I can't ask others to honor our Constitution if I'm not willing to do the same." It's easy to criticize from a podium. It's harder to admit when you've crossed a line and walk back toward understanding. But that's the work. That's what public service means. The moment became more than a story, it became a mirror. Law schools began analyzing the exchange as an example of institutional balance and civic virtue. Editorials described it as a rare but necessary reminder that respect and reform can coexist. Weeks later, when asked if she had spoken again with Judge Jones, Crockett smiled. "Yes," she said. "We may come from different worlds, but now we speak the same language, the language of the Constitution. And I think that's what America needs more of." In a time of shouting matches and partisan walls, a congresswoman and a judge had managed something extraordinary. They had turned confrontation into collaboration, pride into purpose, and a single courtroom exchange into a national lesson in grace. Sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do, Congresswoman Crockett reflected, is to acknowledge when they've been wrong. Her voice carried calm conviction, the kind that comes only after honest introspection. "I came to realize that my approach, however well-intentioned, was working against the very principles I set out to defend. Judge Jones helped me see that respect for our institutions and the pursuit of justice reform are not opposing forces. They are, in truth, essential partners." Her words resonated across the nation, echoing a sentiment long absent from modern political discourse. In her own remarks, Judge Jones later emphasized how crucial that courtroom moment had been for American democracy. "What Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated," she said, "is exactly what our system needs. Leaders who are not only passionate, but teachable, who are willing to grow, to reflect, and to place the integrity of our institutions above the pride of personal politics." The separation of powers only works when each branch respects the others. Today, we saw that respect coexists with true advocacy for change. The impact of their exchange spread far beyond that single courtroom. Within weeks, universities across the country began studying the encounter as a landmark in civic education. Law schools added video footage of the dialogue to their constitutional law lectures, calling it a living lesson in inter-branch respect and the balance of power. Political science professors described it as a model of how democracy is meant to function, not through hostility or domination, but through thoughtful collaboration and humility. But the most profound change happened in the world of politics itself. Inspired by Crockett's public accountability, several lawmakers from both parties took to the floor to soften their rhetoric toward the judiciary, crediting her for reminding them that disagreement does not require disrespect. One senator admitted, "It made me rethink how I speak about judges. The point isn't to shame them. It's to make better laws so they can serve justice more fairly." 6 weeks after the historic exchange, Representative Crockett and Judge Jones stood side by side once again, this time not in confrontation, but in unity. They shared the stage at a national symposium on constitutional governance, addressing an audience of judges, legislators, and law students. Their joint appearance, once unimaginable, was now celebrated as a defining symbol of institutional cooperation. Crockett spoke first. "What Judge Jones helped me see," she said with heartfelt sincerity, "is that real reform doesn't begin with outrage. It begins with understanding. You can't strengthen democracy by weakening the very structures that hold it together. Respect isn't surrender. It's the foundation of progress." Judge Jones followed, her words measured and proud. "Congresswoman Crockett has shown that conviction and respect can coexist beautifully. Since our exchange, her legislative work has reflected a deeper understanding of constitutional boundaries, and, as a result, it has become even more effective. That's what principled leadership looks like." Their message was met with standing ovations from every corner of the room: judges, lawmakers, professors, and students alike. Attendees described it as a moment of clarity in a time clouded by division, a reminder that wisdom and humility are not signs of weakness but of moral strength. Over the following months, the influence of their conversation continued to ripple through American law and politics. Young attorneys referenced the event in graduation speeches. Future policymakers cited it as a turning point in their understanding of leadership. Law journals published essays titled "The Crockett-Jones Exchange," a case study in institutional integrity. One constitutional law professor summed it up best. "What we saw between Judge Jones and Representative Crockett wasn't just civility, it was constitutional maturity. It was a rare glimpse of democracy functioning as it was meant to, with humility, respect, and an unshakable commitment to principle over pride." In an era when soundbites often replaced substance, their exchange reminded Americans that true strength lies in the courage to listen, and that progress, at its core, requires cooperation, not conquest. It became a touchstone moment, proof that even amid division, integrity could still prevail. And in the end, what began as a clash between a passionate lawmaker and a principled judge became something far greater, a testament to what can happen when humility meets wisdom in the service of the Constitution. Judge Edith Jones's steadfast defense of judicial independence, paired with Representative Jasmine Crockett's open-hearted response, didn't just inspire a courtroom that day. They reignited faith in the American experiment itself, the belief that democracy endures not because its leaders are perfect, but because they are willing to learn, evolve, and place the nation's values above their own egos. If stories like this renew your confidence in American leadership and the enduring strength of its principles, subscribe and stay with us. We'll continue bringing you stories that celebrate real integrity, courage, and the timeless ideals that keep our democracy alive.